Thank you very much for joining us again. This is a second briefing for the 2023 Disaster Challenge. This briefing is focused on learning a little bit more about the wicked problem that we've posed for the challenge this year. So I'd like to open today's session by acknowledging that we're meeting from across a range of Aboriginal lands today and that we are guests on these lands. I'm joining you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'm in Eastern Melbourne or Naarm. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and also recognise that these lands and waters have always been places of teaching, research and learning, and that sovereignty has not been ceded. So some of you will have met me in the first Disaster Challenge briefing. My name's Blythe McLennan. I'm a research manager at Natural Hazards Research Australia, and I'm coordinating this year's Disaster Challenge along with a working group, a very capable working group based in Victoria. So this year, the wicked problem we've asked entrants in the Disaster Challenge to tackle is a very broad and very fundamental one in disaster management. So I'll just give the question to you to sort of remind us of what we're talking about today. In the midst of disruption, chaos and calamity, how can resources from across society be accessed and connected in new and innovative ways to improve disaster response and link those who have resources and supports with those who are most in need? So this is obviously a really big, broad and very fundamental problem in disaster response, and there are many different aspects to it. So the real purpose of the session today is to breathe some life into that challenge, to help you think about what it can look and feel like on the ground in real life, why it's wicked and why it's difficult to solve. And to do that, in this session, I'll be posing some questions to a panel of people who together, I've worked out, we had 4 panelists, so between the 4 panelists, over 100 years worth of combined practical experience in emergency and disaster management. We have one panel member who I think's internet has defeated him up in Kinglake and he won't be able to join us today. So we have 3 members of a panel, but as I said to them, that just gives them an opportunity to talk more about their own experiences, which are run very deep. So just before I introduce the panel, I just want to note a few points with you. So first, as I noted in our first briefing, we're not expecting entrants to kind of solve this entire problem. This is a big, wide, broad problem. And by their nature, wicked problems are very difficult to solve and can't be solved in a single step or with a single solution. So with that in mind, you'll see that the conversation with the panel could go in lots of different directions. And we're probably going to talk about some very specific examples and experiences. So if the example that you're interested in tackling isn't specifically discussed, that doesn't mean it's out of scope. It just means there's so many different things we could be talking about. Please still feel free to ask questions about it, and the panel will do their best to respond to your questions from their experience. I also just wanted to quickly acknowledge that it can be quite tricky to talk about problems and challenges in responding to disasters without being interpreted as sort of criticising what we currently do as not being good enough. I think it's really important to acknowledge that, and also just to recognise that the panel's come here today quite ready to be very direct and honest in talking about challenges. And I want to just encourage you to interpret the discussion today as really being about looking for opportunities to improve what we do, because we can always improve what we can do. There's always something more that we can do better. So that's what we're looking for, and that's kind of the tone of the discussion today. So that's enough preamble from me. So it's time to meet the panel. Start with Peter. So Peter's a member of the CFA. He's been a member of the CFA for the last 38 years, and he's had a range of numerous roles across the state. I'll list a few of them. Group officer, he's been a captain and firefighter. He's a level 3 incidents officer, sector commander. He's been a level 2 planning and ops officer. He's worked at Intergraph as a police dispatcher and with Emergency Services Telecommunications Authority as a customer service manager in fire, looking at projects with introducing new tech and mapping on the state, and has worked with dispatching of aircraft for the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. So a lot of experience in allocation and resourcing for emergency response. So I'll jump up now to Linda. So Linda is a community development and engagement professional. She's got extensive experience in recovery roles, particularly following the Hazelwood mine fires and the Yarra South bushfires. And I'm sure Linda will tell us a little bit more about those experiences in a moment. So she also has a lived experience of living through the Malakuta bushfires And that experience has strengthened her desire to use her personal and professional experience to support communities during emergency events and recovery. So she is currently the community recovery team lead, coordinator, at Yarra Rangers Council. Fiona. So Fiona's emergency management professional. She's got over 25 years experience in both public and private sector. She's currently the Victorian State Manager for Emergency Services at the Australian Red Cross. Fiona is responsible for leading and implementing effective statewide service delivery, capability development, advocacy to promote the importance of humanitarian impacts, and to drive reform that delivers better outcomes for all people. And I'll ask her in a moment to talk a little bit more about the Red Cross role in supporting communities and emergencies and disasters. Michael Hellwege is here. Michael has been a member of the Victoria SES for 39 years. He's with the Mildura Unit. So for those who are not from Victoria, that's up in northwest Victoria along the banks of the Murray on the Victorian side. And Mildura is a regional city, about 35,000 people. He was a unit controller. He's been a unit controller for 25 years and managed 3 major incidents up there where the numbers of jobs for that Vic SES unit absolutely skyrocketed. And they included jobs around flash flooding, trees down, and building damage. I think that's enough from me for introduction, because I'd like to spend the bulk of the session hearing from the panel. So thank you very much. Get your mics ready. I'm a little bit fascinated to see where the discussion goes today, because there's so many different places we could take it. So I think it's right to start with a community point of view and community experience of disasters and emergency events first. So I'll start with you, Linda. Can you tell me a little bit more sort of about your role at council, but also your experience of responding to disasters, more lived experience of responding to disaster? And feel free to just choose one example to focus on if you'd like to draw that out.
Thank you, and hello to all of the panel members and our students today. To drill down to one disaster is probably a bit tricky, but I think given what we're going to discuss around new technologies and how we would use them, I think, so for those that of you that aren't familiar, I work primarily on the 9th of June storm. So that's the biggest storm that Victoria has seen in recorded history. It touched down in Wellington Shire Council in the east and blew right through out to the other side of the state through McLennan Ranges. The epicentre is in the Dandenongs, where we lost 25,000 massive giant mountain ash trees. So talking 60-metre high trees with 2-metre diameter. That took out about 70 homes and impacted many, many more. But trying to get into our communities to help them was really problematic, because their services aren't equipped to cut clear those kinds of trees on certainly not on the side of Mount Dandenong. So that took days and days, but we had no power in the lead up to the storm. We had no water because of the mountain. We have a lot of residents on septic, so with no power, there's no showers, there's no flushing toilets. We lost NBN, so for weeks at a time, even the most basic 000 call couldn't be made. No ability to charge smartphones, and no phone towers that held the distance for days and days at a time. For community, I remember in the very early part, somebody said to me, "Why didn't you do a mail out?" I know we're talking about tech, but they said the one thing that was working was Australia Post. They said, the postie was climbing over fallen trees to get the mail delivery out. And for some parts of those communities, they would go to the post office and collect their mail. That would have been a really good way of keeping people informed. But the flip side of that is Australia Post would need to do, campaign targeter, and that would take 2 to 3 weeks. So, there's definitely some room for innovation in that. But I think the core for a lot of these emergencies is really that social connectedness, where you can rely on the grapevine. And similarly with the Malakuta disaster, And no offence intended for all of the hierarchy that, you know, organised the community meeting the day before the fire came through. It wasn't advertised anywhere. Wasn't on the EMV app, the Vic Emergency app. It wasn't on social media. I think it went up 4 minutes before the fire, before the meeting started. So again, you know, the tech was there. Most mobile phone towers had failed by that stage. But, you know, we have all this technology, but at when push comes to shove, we often lose the whole lot, lock, stock and barrel. So it is a very wicked problem, even to just pre-warn people about what's coming and then to connect them to services after. So I might leave it there, Blythe, if that's all right. But happy to take questions after. Thanks.
No, that's wonderful. As I think we said when we were having a chat beforehand, it's very easy to go to tech solutions when you're thinking about innovation, but in this terrain, there's actually some real reasons to think about innovation in a different way and not necessarily go straight to tech solutions. And tech can be very appropriate for some aspects, but it's good to remember that when disaster events happen, kind of tech and infrastructure and comms and things can be really impacted. And so the first thing you would think about in a kind of a business as usual time might not be the best way to do things in the time of a disaster event, because it's very different conditions. So that's, I think, very important for people to consider. Thank you. I might throw across now to Michael and pose pretty much the same question. If you can tell me a little bit about your role and Vic SES's role and your experience, the Mildura Unit in responding to some of those bigger events that you had to deal with.
Yeah, thank you. So we had, we've had 3 large events. So the State Emergency Service is the primary response to storm and flood. So that's anything involving water, trees and building damage, basically, as far as that. So in 2011, we had a fairly wet December, January. Then on the 4th of February at about 3:30 in the afternoon, we copped a severe rainstorm, which was 2 cyclones that formed, one on each side of the country, collided in the middle up in the Northern Territory, and basically dropped straight down the centre, and it dumped 200 mil of rain within about 2 hours on Mildura, and that's our yearly rainfall. So the ground was already wet, so that water had nowhere to go other than fill up streets, fill up houses. I think we had in excess of 300 houses that were inundated with water. In the recent flood at the end of last year, we had 30 houses flooded from the Murray River. So in comparison, this was so much worse. So the rain started about 3:30 in the afternoon on Friday. By 10 o'clock on Saturday night, we'd had 550 calls for assistance. Our normal average for the year is about 180. So that gives you a bit of an idea of the sort of the size of this particular event. And we had 16 unit volunteers available to respond to those calls. So that put 3 vehicles on the road, a crew in the local headquarters trying to coordinate the whole thing. It took us pretty much all night Friday night just to get our head around all the calls we had, what jobs they were, where they were, because it wasn't just Mildura, it was the whole surrounding district. The other issue that we had at that particular time is the Murray River was in flood at Swan Hill, and a lot of the SES focus had been at Swan Hill, also upstream, Echuca, Rochester, all of those areas prior to this. We had a high river, which then stopped the floodwaters from draining into the river, so it banked it all up as well. And because the state had been going for 2 months, all the SES and a lot of the other resources from other agencies was pretty much worn out. They had it. So getting support and backup into Mildura didn't happen until Sunday. And overnight Saturday, pumps had gone down, drainage had gone down, and we actually had an area of just out of Mildura with about 50 homes that ended up being flooded. So we were doing evacuations on Sunday morning, where Saturday night we thought, oh, beauty, we've knocked it all over, we're pretty much right. then all of a sudden we're out evacuating a whole lot of people from their houses in probably 1 metre plus deep water. We were using boats to ferry people out of their homes to higher ground, and that went on for pretty much half the day, getting all of that done. So our closest support unit of a reasonable size that can assist us is in Swan Hill. So there's 2.5 hours travel time without the time to get people organised to actually start the travel. In that situation, we ended up with crews coming out of South Australia because Victoria just didn't have anybody available that was able to come to Mildura. And the South Australian crews were here at that stage for about 4 to 5 days. As the unit controller and main coordinator of that event. So that happened on Friday afternoon. I sat down with my family for dinner on the following Thursday night. That was the first time I'd seen them since that event happened. I'd go home, they'd all be in bed asleep. I'd be up and gone before they woke up. So it was just the scale of everything that had to happen, all the resources that were coming in and things like that. The 2016, 2017 were more storms. So they were trees, building damage. Again, we had South Australian crews come across for that. And in one of those events, I forget which one it was, but we also lost all our communications, our internet connection. So we lost access to all of our technology that gave us a list of all the jobs that we had. So we could then triage those jobs. We also lost power for 24 hours. So we were operating our building with a generator sitting outside and a heap of extension cords running around the building upstairs to try and keep all our technology working as best we could. So that was a real challenge during that particular event.
Thank you. I was just going to ask, so 16 volunteers across sort of that period you're talking about with the floods, was it the same 16 volunteers, or was you were the same volunteer turning out across that period if you didn't see your family till Thursday?
Yeah.
But was that the same people having to turn out across that time? Did you have sort of any, I guess once the interstate and other crews came in, you got a bit of kind of backup support? But
yeah, so the 16 that were available from the local members, they were basically running all the weekend, and then they organised backup crews to come in on Monday because a lot of our volunteers needed to go back to work. The nature of their work is that they just couldn't leave. They were busy, or they were in a particular area where they had no backup support at work. So most of our volunteers had to go back to work. So I think there was a group of about 4 or 5 of us that were still available during that particular week, but most of them went back, and we were relying on the interstate crews from South Australia. Now, a lot of them came from Adelaide, so they were driving trucks, utes with trailers, so that's nearly a 5-hour drive to get here as well. So
yeah, I think that's such a good example of the challenges in resourcing response in rural areas. I know when the working group was discussing what challenge to pose this year and sort of what kinds of challenges they'd like to see tackled with innovative responses, that issue of rural areas and having resourcing in rural areas and smaller communities or something, especially remote communities, but was factored really highly. And I think most people know that, especially in rural areas, very volunteer based for fire and emergency services. So as Michael's mentioned, there's challenges just individually for volunteers in balancing their volunteer work during times like that and their day-to-day job and family and other commitments. So when you have prolonged and very large events, that's quite an ask of the local volunteers and local units. Thank you, Michael. So I'll pass across now to Fiona. So Fiona's with Australian Red Cross. So if you can tell us a little bit sort of about the role of Red Cross and your experiences with communities and what you see communities, what sorts of supports communities need during emergency times.
Yeah, thanks, Blythe, and hi everyone, other panelists. and all participants. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands on which I'm coming from, which is Boonwurrung land, which is part of the Kulin Nation, and also pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So it's rare that I come across folks that don't really know what the Red Cross do, but it's also rare when I come across folks that know everything that Red Cross do. For those that are a little less aware of the role of Red Cross, the Australian Red Cross is actually one of about 192 National Red Cross and Red Crescent societies globally. And we generally work alongside government. So we're established actually under a royal charter. And we act as what's called auxiliary to public authorities or government, primarily in that humanitarian field. So we respond to natural disasters, other domestic emergencies, and we also provide humanitarian services during armed conflict. One of the key programs for Red Cross, we have a range of different programs, including migrant programs and community-based programs, but one of the significant programs across the country and internationally is obviously our emergency services function and responsibilities, which differ state to state, but in Victoria, we are actually, we sit under what are the state arrangements through the State Emergency Management Plan. And we all know that disasters really profoundly affect people's well-being, and disasters and emergencies will often have that consequential effect of really reducing people's ability to not only function day to day, but have impacts much longer term. And we do know that the human costs of disasters are equal and often greater than the physical costs of them. And so hence why we often see really long tails of issues and consequence into recovery that can last many years. We still work with communities impacted by the 2009 bushfires. So the work that we do is primarily with people and communities and government to help them prepare for, respond to and recover from the emergencies they experience. And we do that three ways. One is through direct service delivery. So we have things that we call psychosocial support services. So that could be psychological first aid, outreach programs, and we also have capability development. So we not only support the capability development of our own personnel and our volunteers, we are a volunteer-based organisation, but we also support the capability development of the community sector through training. And one of the other really important parts of what we do, the third kind of pillar, is advocacy. So we spend quite some time promoting the importance of humanitarian impacts, the human impacts of emergencies. So in Victoria, we have a team that responds to emergencies in Vic, and I work with all of my colleagues on screen to deliver that. And just acknowledging the significant contribution of the other volunteer services. My husband's also a SES volunteer, so Michael and I know full well the challenges in that space. To give you a bit of an example of what Red Cross does, during the current or the more recent flood emergency in Victoria, we had about 240 volunteers mobilised to respond to that event. They probably collectively did around 8,200 hours of work in community just during the event itself. And we managed to provide direct service through that psychosocial support service and emergency food relief to about 5,200 people directly, and provide about 16,000 with access to information and supports through the work we're able to do. So really significant reach, and we can only do that with the support of our volunteers that are local and on ground. But obviously that comes with complexity around integrating both at the local and then at the state level, which is where I mainly sit, and coordinating that on ground has some significant challenges. And just reflecting on my colleagues and the panelists have spoken about some of the challenges that you hit in emergencies. It could be accessibility, it could be connection, and there's a range of things that we need to be really live to and adaptable to. I think at one point we had Red Cross personnel going out on tinnies to get into some isolated communities, and you can only do that through a really strongly coordinated approach, but that has its challenges when you consider the types of emergencies that we respond to, and often we're responding in areas that are not only difficult to get to in the first place, but also difficult to support longer term, because we need to move personnel around from other areas to support that. That's a little précis of what we do, a bit of background and a bit of sort of, and don't know if you want me to cover anything else, Blythe, right now.
Yep, no, that's good. I'm sure I've got other questions for you coming up though. I wondered if you might want to add a little bit around, so I know people who aren't impacted when a disaster event happens want to help. And I know that that's either through donations or want to step up and say, I want to do something. There's a real drive and interest from people to support. But I know there's some challenges, especially around coordination with that, which you've touched on, coordinating challenges, which are always there in responding. If you wanted to touch maybe on that coordinating challenge around people who aren't previously trained and wanting to help.
Yeah, look, it's been an enduring challenge for some time. You know, post 2009, I think people donated collectively enough donated goods that would fill the MCG, for example. So if you can imagine the logistical effort that takes to not only coordinate that, but to sort it and then distribute it, etc. But I think too, apart from the coordination challenges, we're seeing really different patterns in volunteering. We're seeing much more spontaneous groups that are purpose-driven rather than, so for an event. And I think one of the things the sector needs to do is probably be able to be more nimble to accommodate that. That goes to coordination, right? It's like if groups are emerging and fulfilling a need for community, how do you enable them to do that without necessarily squashing that, but also bring them into and make sure that everyone's safety is addressed, and you know, they're not doing things that would, you know, potentially lead to risk or over engagement or complication for people that are currently experiencing emergency or who are traumatized. So I think shifting patterns of volunteering is also a real challenge for coordination. Harnessing and controlling spontaneity is anyone knows how to solve that wicked problem, please let the sector know. You know, we have what we consider our more traditional volunteering programs, like the members we have on today, including the Red Cross. But there are some emerging volunteering programs that you can join quickly to donate your time. Blaze Aid would be one, for example, where you can put your name down to join a base camp and go and help fix fences, for example. So I think we just need to be a bit more adaptable and flexible and make sure our arrangements can accommodate that kind of behaviour rather than necessarily consider it as an issue to manage. I think is probably a core part of what we need to do a little bit better as a sector, and because, you know, we've seen some incredibly amazing effort come out of those spontaneous examples. One of those is following Hurricane Katrina. I think a bunch of university students at the time created a program. We've now created a program it's called the Pillowcase program. What they did is they went around, they didn't know what to pack all their stuff in, so they chucked everything in a pillowcase, and then they actually did a bit of work post the emergency while they were still kind of recovering themselves into sharing that advice and information. So the Red Cross actually picked up on that and created a program called the Pillowcase program, which is a preparedness piece that we do with school students. So there's a lot of really good stuff that comes out of that spontaneity and how people respond themselves. It's about how you accommodate it and how you can embrace it in what is quite a structured environment, in a kind of command control, to use an incident management term. But I'm sure my colleagues at CFA and SS would be able to much better explain that command control structure to everyone.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Peter, your turn. So there's so many different things that I know Peter could speak to, so I'm a little bit interested to see which one you're going to pick. So I won't give you too much preamble. What would you like to say to add to what the panel has said so far about kind of experiences and roles in responding to disaster?
I'll follow on from Linda's path, if you like, because it has a whole gambit of issues associated with it that affect not only just an emergency, but potentially day-to-day stuff as well. And I'll give you the scenario. So the storm that Linda indicated affected my patch as well, although it was not expected, to say is an understatement. And the theme of all my stuff is all about communication, both within an organisation and across organisations how to respond. So in a multi-agency environment, the CFA were a support agency to the SES in this particular incident. And to be fair to say it had been run at a local level is a pretty good guess. but there are several local levels in my area that were being ran as dealing with their own local issues. In my patch, I have 3 valleys, and one of the particular valleys was hit hard, so much so that the main power line into the area was cut, which in itself is no big deal. This happened around about 10 p.m, so give a bit of a context in timing. But after, and the local resources, which is only the fire brigade, there's no other local resources there. The police, interestingly enough, were on the wrong side of the storm. They were down with me, and they couldn't get up to where they need to go unless they went right around the long way, which they ended up doing about 4 a.m. That was after being starting at 7 a.m. the day before. So he had a long shift, poor bugger. Anyway, so the power was cut into this one particular community. It had NBN installed as the means of his communications, and therefore they lost all their copper infrastructure for the telephony. They utilised mobile phones. The radios, funnily enough, also used NBN to get out of the area. This is the emergency services radios. So after about 2:33 a.m, the batteries died. So there was no power to the telecommunications network. We had a unit out there that was minding a down power line, 66 kV volt power line across the road. That, as far as we were aware at that stage, was still energised. After about 4 a.m, it was determined that it was safe for them to return back to their station. And where they were situated, they were able to take a use of fortuitous radio coverage. This is unknown to us at this stage, by the way. So when they turned around and they went back, we've lost communication with them. We couldn't raise them. We couldn't ring anybody because the phones were out. And we couldn't radio them. We had no way of communicating with this particular resource that's sitting somewhere. We don't know exactly where. And it turned out later on that they couldn't ring in because they had no phones. And when I made the comment to one of my superiors, for want of a better word, talking about command and control, the comment was, when somebody rings 000, I said, well, they won't be able to ring 000 because they've got no phones. There's no mobile phones. There's no landline per se anymore because of the NBN, so they're all IP based. So they won't be able to make any 000 calls, which is great because we've got no radio coverage, even if they could ring 000. So it was, they were completely isolated. That same community 12 years earlier was isolated again, but it was pre-NBN and it was because of a fire. Same theory, basically. The trees dropped and they lost all their power, and but they had the old copper network, and they had also established a phone tree within the community. So if something did happen, they at least can talk to each other and they can get help within their own, but become a self-sufficient community. But they didn't have the opportunity under NBN. And because of the time of the night, most of the people in the town would not have been aware of it. They would have been asleep. It's only when they woke up at 6 o'clock or tried to wake up at 6 o'clock and get out of there, because most of them didn't work there, they worked elsewhere, and the roads were blocked in and out of that particular town. So that's all about communication. Overarching all of that, though, was, I said the CFA was a support agency. The control agency, the SES, had put an alert over the whole incident. It was too dangerous to be out chopping trees with the wind still pushing trees over. And we're talking about, as Linda indicated, the size of the mountain ash. In fact, we've had at that stage 5 cars where the trees fell on them. Luckily, nobody was injured because it was just at the motor end or just at the rear end of the car. So there's a lot of things that happen that we're just lucky it didn't actually achieve. Well, nobody was hurt. That was the overarching thing. But there's a loss of power, and power went, as a result of the power, the communication went out. Even to the point where they got single wire earth return, or the SWER system, into a particular road. The whole road was isolated, but nobody was aware that the power was off that. It was only one of the members of the brigade that lived on that road, and they drove out to make a phone call to let them know that there's no power or no internet at all in that particular location. So even the community information wasn't being able to be passed on until about a week or so down the track. And that's pretty much the doom and gloom stuff. But at the end of the day, because of a lot of timing and all that sort of stuff, there was no major issues other than potential issues this time.
Thank you. I guess that's another danger in talking about problems and how to fix problems is you end up talking about all the negative things. So I guess the backdrop to all of this discussion is what an amazing job is done to respond to disasters. What we're looking at is constantly improving and finding those areas where we need more innovation to improve. But so I hope people listening aren't thinking that it's sort of all goes to rack and ruin, because that's certainly not the case. I wondered, Linda, if you wanted to respond to that, because we talked a little bit about NBN and changes in comms tech, if you wanted to add anything to what Peter was saying there.
I really enjoyed what Peter had to say. It's good to hear it from somebody else's perspective, because I wasn't aware that it implicated radio as well. The flip side is that was the 9th of June, 10th of June for the Victorians. Lockdown's over. We can all go out and play. So we dropped off the media circus very quickly as well. You know, our disaster didn't get the traction it would have got had it been a bushfire and we weren't in lockdown. So the lockdown itself and the COVID restrictions caused further issues where we weren't able to run a council emergency relief centre either. So we had to be pretty nimble once we could get into some of these areas. Again, we had to look at where there was council facilities or community facilities that we could activate. But we brought in portable ensuites. So we called them power and shower sites. And because of the COVID restrictions, we could only allow people to recharge their phone, have a cuppa, have a shower, and then they had to go home. You couldn't hold people in those centres like we would have in a traditional setting. But we had similar issues, Peter, where it was, months for some people before there was an acceptance that no, they didn't have power back on, because they were, part of one street that were off power for a long time. Yeah, it's really tricky. And I found the irony of the NBN updates, as I mentioned to Blythe earlier. The only way you could find out when NBN was coming back on was via their blog. If you had a phone reception and you had charge, so something's got to give, I think. But you're right. We're lucky nobody died in that storm. It was horrendous.
I think that your example of those portable units is actually a really good example of how you can have little simple, so innovation doesn't have to be complex and, very technologically driven. It can be a good idea that serves a need. It made me think actually of the Orange Sky, the kind of laundry and shower service for homeless people that started by 2 young men up in Queensland that has portable units just to provide this kind of the social support, but also essential services for homeless people. It doesn't with like a volunteer base behind it to support it.
Yes,
the idea is that innovation doesn't have to be. It can be simple, and you don't have to solve the whole of the problem. You can find a little piece of it, target it, and do something really, really impactful with a potentially simple idea, but just a lot of enthusiasm behind it. And I think it's all very people driven. It's all very human. That's a lot in emergency management.
And so important. Orange Sky actually came in and supported one of our communities. I had some early discussions with them, but they engaged with our local community group, which was fabulous. So I can give you one community story. Again, come back to that power outage, but the young family were impacted. The children were wetting their beds from the fear. They got no washing service. They've got no ability to wash and it doesn't take most families long before you run out of clean clothes and clean linen. So that Orange Sky offering where they could go and wash and dry linen and try and keep on top of things like that was really important. And that's where the idea of the portable showers came from, because I was looking at that, the shower bus, again, homeless services. So those services also come with a deep understanding of people that have been in some form of trauma, and it's very easy for them, and they're usually very keen to help. To just bring in something that's self-sufficient. All we had to do was have a water supply. So those portable showers, they ran on gas. We just had to have some stable ground and some supervision. And again, one thing we found was really making sure, and this is a lesson for us, women that have been impacted by domestic violence. I know one that we supported, she said she never felt safe to come in and use the portable showers because she didn't want to be naked anywhere that she didn't feel 110% safe. So, you know, she didn't shower for weeks until power was restored at her home. So again, really wicked problems, but really making sure that we provide dignity and safety for our most vulnerable residents.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things there jump out to me as you're speaking as well. One is, and this is something we talked about in our first briefing for the disaster challenges as well, is that innovation doesn't necessarily mean something completely brand new. It can be an idea from one place applied differently to another place, like services designed to support homeless people being kind of pivoted and reapplied in a different context to supporting communities that have been disaster impacted, for example, that you can seek sources of innovation from lots of different places. So I think that's quite a good sort of takeaway from that. I want to talk a little bit, and I'll throw to you in a moment, Fiona, about the psychosocial support, because that is such an important thing that perhaps in the past, that kind of area of resourcing support is probably not given as much attention. I think it is increasing. I wanted to share just a little anecdote I heard from someone, and this was during the Black Saturday fires in 2009 in Victoria. Someone who was supporting their community, a group came up with a coffee truck, and at first she was quite indignant, like, you know, we've got much more serious issues than coffee. What on earth are you doing? This is useless. That coffee truck became a central point where everybody came together and just took a little moment out and had a cup of coffee and felt normal. And she said that and kind of came together and had chats and said, how are you going? It actually became a really, really important connection point for the community. And she sort of ate her words later and thought that was actually an amazing contribution to make to this community, to give them that little bit of support. So I wanted to throw to you, to Fiona, just talk a little bit more about that psychosocial support and the kinds of resources or kinds of, I guess, innovation and improvements you'd like to see in the provision of like psychosocial support and well-being for people. So for communities who are directly impacted, and also for those who are helping and responding, because I think that's very important to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, you're right. And you know, I'm sure that the participants will probably either doing or have done some due diligence already, and we know that you know, the cost of disasters is just going to get bigger, and predominantly that cost is not in the response, even though it is significant. I think the Australian Business Roundtable, when they looked at the 2009 bushfires, out of the $7 billion that it cost, I think 77 million was in the response, and 990 million was in sort of a family violence space post that emergency. Mental health was thought to have cost $1 billion post that emergency. And chronic disease, interestingly, is another one that the roundtable found was really more on a significant increase post-emergencies, and particularly post-flood emergencies in particular can have a massive impact on chronic health and chronic disease. So, you know, and Linda's right too, there is it's not a causation, but there is a correlation then between also around increased incidence of family violence, particularly where there's heavy drinking during a post-emergencies and other lived trauma experiences that they might be re-emerging. And interestingly enough, we also saw the power of collective trauma on whole communities and a whole state even during and post the Burke Street tragedy as well, and the significant importance that we need to place on ensuring that people have access to and the ability to be able to have access to trained professionals, whether that be professionals like social workers, psychologists, psychiatrists, but also immediate support where people are trained to understand somebody's trauma story, to be able to link them to appropriate services and be able to allow them to take really small steps in what is going to be a very big journey for them, pending the consequence of what they've gone through. Infrastructure losses do get a lot of visibility. We need to make sure that we're maintaining our infrastructure, but the far less obvious but equally important are those psychological and social impacts. I think one of the stats I remember, you may not want to quote this, but around 20% of the people affected by the 2009 Victorian bushfires still experience some level of PTSD and depression post 10 years, and that came out of the University of Melbourne Beyond Disaster Study. So it's a significant part of the way that we need to consider what is a system of emergency services and emergency management. I will say though, there are some really amazing examples of that. You were just talking about, Blythe, of how people take ideas and they might seem small, but they become such critical parts of people's recovery and community connection. So connecting people back. Linda's probably got a list as long as my arms, but of things like that. But just post the 2018 St Patrick Day bushfires were up in the Bowen Southwest area. I think it was Corangamite, Linda, but they had a little I think it was a coffee and sausage truck, and so they'd go, because there was some distance involved in reaching some of their farming communities, and they'd go and they'd travel around and they'd spend some time, and people would often go to the neighbour's place at the same time the truck was arriving. There's some incredibly impressive creative recovery programs as well. That are run that incorporate our First Nations people and the impact that emergencies have on our connection to place and land and community for our First Nations peoples. But also, I heard about one. I think it was run post 2009. It was called Women and Chainsaws. And they effectively were doing artwork by using chainsaws, and so it was designed or really kind of targeted at women to make them more comfortable with using equipment. So how to start a pump, how to wield a chainsaw, but at the same time they found that the community started to attend. So husbands and sisters and brothers and family members would start to come along to these sessions, and all of a sudden you were dealing with a very creative, hands-on thing that became a connection piece where they could talk about their trauma and they could talk about their own stories and they could share them in a way that didn't feel threatening. It's not like you're sitting one-on-one having a conversation with somebody face-to-face. We often find that some of the best outcomes, and Linda can probably speak to this really beautifully, are where it's almost psychosocial support by stealth. Where community just have the opportunity to come together to be able to connect and share their own stories with people that understand it, and to have then this baseline of support that's kind of wraps around them to make sure that they're safe, and that's part of what we do. I am going to be slightly contentious though, and yes, I think that we should continue to invest into psychosocial support and health. But I also think that the system itself is really prepared for a shift into resilience. We have to start looking at the system of before, the preparation and the preparedness piece. We can't hope to think that our response to an emergency is going to solve for what are entrenched complex social policy issues that we see the consequence of, or the effect of. I'm talking about things like food insecurity, housing insecurity, income, job insecurity. We deal with those in emergencies, but we need to start to think about how we pull better together to be able to address it from a preparedness perspective, so we can be more agile and just like slot things in. I'm using my hands a lot, sorry. Slot things into the way that we deliver our emergency response, relief and recovery. I'll leave it there because I get a bit animated about that.
That's great. Thank you. Linda, you wanted to follow up?
Thank you. I'd just like to add climate change denial to Fiona's list. How many people have died because they thought it's not happening? This flood is not going to impact us. This fire is not going to impact us. We've been through this before, and then they die. That's my personal view on, leading people up the garden path to think that these climate change events are not happening. You know, I'd never want people to see what I saw in Mallacoota. It's absolutely the most terrifying thing you can ever go through. And being trapped there, there was no opportunity to evacuate. You were held to ransom while you watched people's houses burn down. And for you know, the last 10 years, we've had our major press and our federal government, you know, making out that this is not happening, and it absolutely is. And I think all of us are working on the pointy end of what happens when we've stuffed the climate completely. Yeah, I'm going to just stop because I get very animated and very angry. Thank you.
Thank you. That's awesome. We're going into some great places. As you were talking, Fiona, I was just thinking it's really important to recognise, like, improving disaster response and outcomes of disaster rates of people. It isn't always things you're doing at the time of response. And we've had a few questions come to me about, oh, is this within scope? Is that within scope for the disaster challenge? I've said we leave what improving disaster response, we leave it to entrants to frame it the way that makes sense to them. But there is a lot that you can do beforehand to improve the way we can respond to disasters, the time of disasters, and some of those things you're talking about, Fiona, food security and all those kind of issues that are like embedded in communities that just kind of come out at times of stress and crisis. There's a lot there to improve what we can do for communities beforehand as well. It doesn't all have to be at that kind of pointy end.
And Blythe, just in response to Sue's question there around that, I actually think, Sue, if we come from a systems perspective, I think the question was around, you know, how it's difficult to tap into the support groups and networks that already exist in communities. So I think from a systems perspective, and really wicked problems are about looking at the systems that we work within. I think we have to get much better, Sue, in devolving decision-making to communities, not just consulting with them. I think we really need to be able to understand who's out there, who's on ground, who are some of the voices that contribute to what are really innovative options for their own communities. We need to get better at devolving that level of decision-making. We're not, I don't think as a system, we're very good at doing that. Certain groups are and others may not be. So I think we need to overall get much better at devolving some of it, allowing them to have a voice. That's how I think we hear them better. And we've all got a role to play. So in really trying to understand how best to do that could be a topic for your wicked problems. So.
Yeah, great answer. Thank you. I wanted to throw this now back to Michael and Peter, because I know within the emergency services, it's not one big homogenous area, and especially at the level of, you know, units and brigades are very community embedded. I just wondered what you think about, so Sue's question was around how difficult it is to tap into support groups and networks that already exist in communities that aren't necessarily official or visible to authorities. I wondered if you wanted to speak to that from the experience of kind of local level units and brigades, because I've seen some really great examples and stories around units and brigades really fostering and connecting into those networks. But then there's also challenges with that, with being part of the formal response as well. So if you wanted to maybe speak to how you kind of manage that dual role of being part of the formal emergency services and also part of the community response at the same time.
Yeah, as Peter said, we work with all the other agencies, but then there's also a lot of community groups. We had a recent flood end of last year, and we were getting the local Sikh community coming in to assist filling sandbags, and they just sort of turned up of their own accord, and they said, where do you want us to go? And they would just come in and they would just spend hours just filling sandbags. But we didn't have contacts. They did that off their own bat. It wasn't something that we asked them to do. One of the issues, probably going back in the 2011, some of the earlier events that we've had here, is interagency communication didn't exist. So SES could talk to SES, CFA could talk to CFA, but we couldn't talk to each other on a common radio network. We now have that in place, which came in the last couple of years with new radio systems that BMV have introduced. So that does help us, because that also brings in police as well. So we do have common channels, whereas a few years ago we didn't have that. So that made it difficult. Even just interagency communication made it very difficult. So to run a large emergency, you needed somebody from each agency in one room together, work out, you would say, oh, we need somebody to do this. So they'd go off, jump on their radio and organise somebody to go and do it, then come back and tell you what they've done. So it's very resource hungry doing that sort of stuff and very time consuming as well. So it does make it difficult.
Peter, did you want to add anything to that about sort of that local level brigade interacting with communities? I know there's sort of within emergency services, there's headquarters and there's procedures and policies and things that are needed. And then there's brigades trying to sort of balancing that with the way communities are working and what they're expecting and how they're wanting to do things. And I've spoken with volunteers before about kind of walking that road between the two. Do you see challenges in that at all?
Yes and no. It's a vexed question because you'll find most emergency service people will do whatever's the best for their community, particularly if it's their own community. And they won't necessarily follow the official doctrine. I shouldn't actually be saying this, but they won't necessarily follow the official doctrine if there's benefits for the longevity of the community. I was fortunate or unfortunate, take your pick. I was spending a lot of time up the Kinglake Ranges, one of the most heavily affected areas as a result of the Black Saturday fires. And I spent 6 weeks there in a firefighting role. I was basically the section commander, which turned out to be a division. So if you're interested in that sort of breakdown of the structure, I suggest you have a look at the State Emergency Response Plan for Victoria, and I'll give you a breakdown of where all these different sectors fit into the gambit. One of the things as part of the storm that we talked about, Linda and I have been talking about in June, was that there was no agency. We were agency blind. My intent at the time was to go across to where the SES controller was, but there was there's about a 1.5 metre diameter tree that says, no, we're not going any further. So in effect, we divided the hill into two parts. So the incident controller looked after the east part and I looked after the west part. Because and it didn't matter whether they were SES or CFA, they were a unit, and the police were on my side too, so it was really convenient for me. But yeah, that doesn't follow the normal practice. And also we end up becoming a refuge unofficially because there was 12 people who were trying to get home and couldn't get home and they had nowhere to go. They couldn't go back and they couldn't go forward. So once again, it didn't go through the official structures. The LGA, after the initial event, were very good at uniting the communities. The phone charging system we mentioned before, there was some criticism about where they were located, but you can't have them in the middle of a paddock on the side of a highway, sort of thing. So, and Linda mentioned about water. Yeah, there's no water because there's no reticulated water up in my part of the world, and there's no sewage system per se, it's all septic. So we've become so reliant on power, so reliant. But what's happened since then is the introduction of, I'm getting off track now, sorry. But the introduced solar panels for a lot of the essential buildings, for the community halls and that sort of stuff, with Wi-Fi connection in there as well. So it's a better place than what it was, but it hasn't been tested. And that's one of the issues I find is the lack of testing. We talk about our own little silos, but we don't often test right across the whole emergency management sector. Sorry, it's a long-winded answer.
No, I think that's good. I think it's actually, I think good to realise that there are, again, it's that thing about what is innovation, is that there are, sometimes there's solutions there, but we're not activating them. Things like solar panels and so then it's about looking at, well, why are we not accessing and activating those things and how do we overcome barriers to them, that can be the source of innovation rather than a brand new idea in putting them to better use for people. So I think that's actually a good little example of that. And I think it's great because I've seen all these little kind of examples coming through of responses and things that have led to improvements that I think are great to show people that it isn't, you know, necessarily like we'd love system-wide change as well, but that there's things that you can do and carve off and have real impact with in these different ways. So that's really good. Okay, I've got a whole list of questions in my own head, but I'll throw it to one from an attendee. So what about health sector and public health physician roles in this? And I think that's a good question to think of, linking in other sectors and areas who aren't, you know, the core of emergency management. And public health is the key role, but does anybody have any thoughts about bringing in and connecting with other sectors beyond those that have like a central mission on EM? Linda?
We were really fortunate after the storm that our local community health provider were really proactive and set up their own triage system for people that needed psychological support. And they provide us with a QR code and a referral form, again, relying on being able to use your phone at that point. And they got underway very quickly, but they got overridden by the state government, unfortunately. So they had all this system in place and the state government came in and appointed somebody else with no discussion locally. So they felt a bit, I don't know, a bit miffed, I guess, a bit disappointed, I guess, because they'd been so nimble and proactive. But they were a really good council partner long term and continue to be. So I think, you know, we continue to work with them, but they didn't get the lead role. From a community health, public health perspective, we had environmental health officers going out and doing the inspections because, as we've talked about, you know, checking that septic systems are still working or, you know, still safe and not causing further public health concerns if they've been hit, and spilling sewage into the street. But also the food waste. That was a big issue for us because you've got thousands of people without power and you've got all this rotting food. So, you know, even having to organise extra waste collections to get that out of the communities, further issues. But with that power outage and the crushed cars, I remember having a conversation with the CFA, I think in the day or two after the storm. I said, can people not get off the mountain to go and get fresh food? And he said they can't. Their garages are crushed, their cars underneath it. So we worked with the Salvation Army and they took their catering truck up and provided hot meals at the CFA. And again, it provided that lovely gathering space for people to come in, collect a meal, say hello to their neighbourhood and then go home. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you. Fiona?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I think the mobilisation of such an incredibly massive and diverse sector as the health sector, in particular, public health, you know, probably came to the fore, and we probably started to realise the benefits of mobilising sectors like that during COVID, right? No matter how you kind of want to put a lens on COVID and the way that decisions were made. And I think that the mobilisation of that sector had incredibly massive benefits for Victorians. And, you know, the way that they were brought into what is a much more traditional EM space from a sort of a, you know, command and control perspective took a while. There was a few things we work under quite different mechanisms. But I think once it became more of this is just how we're doing it, local public health units and others, I just think drove such an incredible, much more incredibly holistic response to the COVID emergency than what we could have delivered as in an EM space alone. So I think that example alone goes to the power of being able to mobilise sectors. I don't know, Blythe, whether or not we can sort of have advice from some of our government colleagues in, answering questions post this, if that's available or not, that, because I don't think I'm doing that question justice at all, but whether or not we could circle back to participants or not with some of these where they may fall out of my specific realm of expertise.
Peter.
Yeah, I'll just answer Dr. Nairn's second part, which is about the preparedness phase, not the response phase. If you look at the more recent floods in northeast Victoria before it got down to Michael's end, one of the pluses, if you like, I saw from the emergency management space was the utilising of the health department in the ICC. Yes, it was an ICC, and it's not traditionally a preparedness phase, but one of those preparedness response phases. It was a bit murky about what part of the process it was. But that was a really good bonus, which we could put things in place as an ICC before the actual flood arrived. We had a bit of time. We had about 13 hours or 14 hours before it actually hit to plan for this sort of stuff. So you can do a little bit in preparedness phase, but that's understanding the relationships you have with each other, which comes through regular exercising.
Yeah, that's great. I think relationships between different helpers and support services, I think, is something that comes up a lot, and having relationships in place beforehand, not just at the time of needing to respond, is an important part. I'll just let people know we'll start to wind up in a couple of minutes because we started a bit late. I was going to try and finish at 5:15, but just as we started, a tech issue's got in the way. I'll run us through just a little bit longer, but we'll be done by 5:25. I wanted to check with Michael and Peter about supports that first responders, so fire emergency responders themselves, need, and where you'd most like to see sort of improvements or innovation for first responders. And Linda and Fiona, I'll ask you a similar question in a moment too, in case you want to think a little bit. I'm just thinking of what the helpers who are helping communities need to be able to support them to fill that role.
I'm a bit old school, so I'll come out and say it. One of the things me personally, I cope really well with black humour. And I think most long-term emergency responders will do the same. However, one of the problems we've got as a society, I think anyway, is the delineation between black humour and political correctness. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I just mean it's got to be taken in context in the circumstances that it's dealing with. In fact, that's one of the things that kept the ICC going during the floods, because it was a long drawn out process. There was a lot of angst about uncontrollable circumstances, and the only way to diffuse, in my view, the only way to diffuse it was the black humour, and it certainly spread around the place very quickly. In fact, a lot of them were actually thanking each other for it.
That's interesting. I've heard similar from doctors, especially in emergency departments, in coping with that kind of pressure of emergency departments. Thanks. That's an interesting answer. Not the answer I was expecting to that question, but I just think humour as a resource and a support. What a fantastic, a fantastic way to think about supports for people. That's really cool. Thanks. Michael, was there anything you wanted to say there about supports for fire emergency service responders?
Yeah, the SES has a peer support program. So they're SES volunteers that have been operational. They've got a number of years experience out in the field, and they do some training in that peer support psychological type situation. So they can come into, and it happens all the time, if we have a rather nasty incident, could be a fatal road accident, whatever, and they can come in and do a defusing. So they talk to us, they try and look at the emotional side of the job, not the operational hands-on side of it. One of the problems with that is that, again, for us being up in the top corner of Victoria, all that stuff is at least 2.5 hours away from getting here to provide that support. It is there and it will come, but it takes time to get it up to us, which is a lot like a lot of any other assistance that we need that's beyond our own capability. And that's SES, that's the CFA, that's DELP, all the agencies that are local that can provide some sort of assistance. Once you burn out or exceed your local capacity, it then takes, you're looking at a few hours to get any additional resources along with that emotional peer support type people as well. So that can be an issue, and then you've got that delay. So that's important to then identify that you need those people very early in the piece so that you can put the request in and get them here hopefully when you need them, not hours after you should have had them. And that's always a bit of a juggle for whoever's running an operation or looking after a group of people, is trying to identify, oh, we need this sort of help. Doesn't matter what it is, but trying to plan ahead far enough to get that help here when you actually need it. So one of the other things with our big flood is we also had an issue where it was also people's livelihoods, impacted a lot of people because we're a dried fruit growing area. So that's all your dried sultanas, all that sort of thing. A lot of the fruit blocks at that time were almost ready to be harvested in February 2011. Some of those were now a metre or more underwater. And they were underwater for a couple of weeks till the water could be pumped away. So that had a big effect on people's livelihoods and also their emotional stability and things like that as well. So not just the water, their house was fine, but their livelihood was then affected. And that takes years to recover. It's not just, oh yeah, the water's gone, everything's good. It takes years for those vines and all that to recover. So some of those people were, it could have been 3-4 years before the vines come back. I know people that were out of their homes for 8 months, 10 months. So that has an effect on their emotions and their mental health as well. So there's a lot of factors that go into the mental health side of things and how people can handle it.
Yeah, I think that's good. And the point there about planning ahead. So if we know these sorts of supports are going to be needed, and we know that the events are coming, especially ones where we have some time to perhaps put some things in place beforehand or early, that I know timing issues of availability of things is a big thing. So that kind of preempting what's going to be needed in different ways, not just for the immediate emergency service response, but also for the supports, for the helping organisations and people that are coming in to help communities, and preparing for that in itself is another area that disaster challenge entrants could decide to look at. All right, so Peter, I think this might be the last thing before we wrap up, but I'll throw to you to respond.
Yeah, thanks. And I apologise, but I'll put a thing in the chat about it's about relationships. Sometimes the peer support works well, and sometimes it doesn't work well enough, or very badly actually. It's almost mutiny type scenario, but it's all about timing. One of the things, it's in my view, is like the bereavement. If when the incident first happens, if you get all the I don't know what the right word is. If you start getting support from peer support or from counselling or whatever immediately, when after 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks, whatever it is, whatever the time frame is, and there's nobody there, that's when you really need it. I've experienced it through the 09 fires, and to a less, I haven't experienced it yet with the floods, but I'm pretty sure it was coming. So it's all about timing as well, and relationships. So sorry to go a little bit longer.
No, that's fine. I think that issue of timing of resourcing and supports and everything is actually quite a really crucial one in all sorts of different areas in responding to disasters. But I will call it to a close there. So I hope that this discussion has helped to fill out and paint a little bit more of a nuanced picture around this wicked challenge for you, and also given you some ideas about ways that we can improve and respond through innovation. And I just encourage people who are attending to reach out to others in the sector if they still have questions, to find out a little bit more specifically around the aspect of this challenge that they'd like to dig into a little bit more. I'll throw to you, Fiona, just before I close off. I think you have a
really
burning
did.
comment that you really need to make.
I did. I'm really sorry. I just wanted to add to that, mental health and wellbeing and the support of our workforce and the people that support people in community is really critical. Can I suggest too, for the participants, that maybe another angle is one of the key things that we find, Red Cross does provide programs and training to support supporters. It's a bespoke thing, but often what they need is a break. So I think for me, if you take the next step back, it's how do you better manage resources from a systems perspective to be able to, is our current way that we're structured delivering the best outcome for the people that are trying to do the work? And so, it's a bit of blue sky thinking, and it's a big thing. But I just, I wanted to sort of leave participants with that as well, that sometimes you have to go a step back further into the system, particularly with these sorts of wicked problems, to maybe be able to think about a solution or parts of a solution that might contribute to then what are better mental health outcomes for and better support for people in the emergency itself.
Yep. Excellent advice. I think that's really actually a wonderful point to finish on. Thank you. So thank you everyone who's joined us. Most importantly, huge thank you to the panel. You've been extremely generous with your time and with your thoughts and responses and honesty and directness today. So I very much appreciate it. And all our entrants will benefit greatly from that. So I do appreciate it. So I'll bring us to a close. Thanks everyone for sticking with us, running a bit over, given that we started a bit late, but I'd just like to say goodbye and best of luck to everyone who's putting entries into the disaster challenge. I can't wait to see what you have for us. And I'm sure this panel and others from the sector are super keen to see what you propose to us as well. So best of luck to everyone. Thanks for your time. Bye.